So good afternoon, welcome to the first one in our series of On the Edge, where for the first 4 sessions, we're going to be looking at being interrupted, and we're going to be joined by the authors of this book for the 4th session, by Al and Ruth. And then the second part of the series, where there are 4 more different individual sessions on different kinds of theologies. So before I begin, and I'm going to hand over to Liz, I will introduce her, although I'm sure a lot of you know already, I'm going to say a prayer, which is a prayer adapted from Augustine of Hippo. So let's pray. Lord Jesus, let me know myself and know you, and desire nothing save only you. Let me do everything for the sake of you. Let me humble myself and exalt you. Let me think of nothing except you. Let me die to myself and live in you. Let me fly from myself and take refuge in you. Let me cling to nothing save only to you. And let me be poor because of you. Look upon me that I may love you. Call me that I may see you and forever enjoy you. Amen. And so to introduce us to the book, Being Interrupted, Liz is going to input the first part and I will input the second. So let me introduce Liz. Canon Liz Shercliff is Director of Studies in Chester Diocese. She's a researcher in practical theology and author of several books, including Preaching Women and Out of the Shadows. So I'm welcoming you, Liz, but you can welcome me too. So welcome, and you'd like to start us off.
Okay, I'll welcome Jane when I've finished doing my input bit. My job today is just to lay the foundations for the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to take you through some PowerPoint slides because that will keep me on track and stop me wandering off. And I want to start with this idea that there are 2 basic economies of church, which if you've read the book, you will know, and suggest some things about those economies of church. The first thing that the book does is to start off with who are we and where do we live? And Al and Ruth focus on the fact that we live in Brexit Britain. We've had problems with the Grenfell, Windrush, and climate crisis, and those all affect the way that we think as a nation and our experience of being British at the moment and church at the moment. I wanted to add in some things because obviously there's a difference between when we are now and when we were when Ruth and Al first wrote the book. So in addition, just this year on the 6th of January, we had the assault on the Capitol building in Washington. We've had COVID and lockdown, which are experiences that are unique and we hope might not be repeated as well. In the Church of England, we're living in a time when we're beginning to think about living in love and faith. And despite our optimism during the pandemic and as churches opened up, it seems that smaller numbers are actually returning to the church buildings. And all of those affect who we are as church and our attitude to the church and to the world around us. They affect our interpretation of what we value and how we value it. According to the book, and I agree with them as well, actually, some of the key problems in the Church of England relate to our privilege or who has privilege in the church, and I've subtitled it Church's Privilege Problem or Lessons in Being Irrelevant. And the first privilege problem is that it's a white dominated church leadership. You don't need to look beyond our own diocese, although you can, and you'll find that most leadership in the church is white at all levels. And that means that it's been slow to respond to some of the problems. Recently, you might have noticed that neither of our archbishops made any comment about the problem in Afghanistan and our withdrawal and the subsequent issues there, despite the fact that it's been traumatic for particularly women and girls there. The second problem is that working classes don't get to speak for themselves. We tend to decide as a church what working classes need and try and input things onto those estates or those areas rather than listen to what people might want. And the church's failings in the area of gender are in some ways more obvious than those relating to race and gender, and in other ways, every bit as subtle and insidious. I think I've quoted that slightly wrong. We are still a male-dominated church, despite the fact that similar numbers are ordained. When we look to what happens after ordination, or indeed the amount of money spent on people's ordination, it differs according to gender lines. And the way we interpret scripture is very male orientated. And we live, and this is one that was near to Jane's heart, I'm sure, we live in an adult-centric society and an adult-centric church. The more I travel around the diocese, the more it seems to me that it doesn't matter how friendly churches say they are. The kind of children and young people that they want are younger versions of themselves, rather than younger Christians who might be able to teach us something. The first economy of church, this is an image from the book. If you've got the book, you'll recognize it. The first economy that we have of the church is this one, where we try basically to bring people into the church because it will make us bigger and it will also help us support our buildings. It's an efficient model because it reaches as many people as possible. And if you think about the latest initiatives in the Church of England, you will see that we want to be efficient because we want to mobilize people in their workplaces and all those kinds of places, in their communities, in their pubs, at the school gate, all those places that are identified by various reports. Part of mobilizing the laity has, a cynical me says, less to do with recognizing the ministry and the baptized state of lay people, and more to do with trying to grow the church in an efficient manner by growing the mission force, if you like. And we've also got, and again, you can see this in recent reports from the church, we've also got this calculability where we assume that more equals better. So the bigger the church, the more successful it is in those terms. And we want a church that's predictable. So if we know what we put in, we should know what we can get out. So we have systems and policies and plans and methods of doing mission or evangelism or whatever it might be. And the church, this model of church is also controlling. So we want to be in charge of telling people what they need rather than asking them what they would like. We give them answers to questions that they haven't necessarily asked. The other model of church, which might be one that we seem to warm to a bit more, is an alternative economy where we pour out things. The church offers things to the wider world. So we try and be of service to others, or we try and speak prophetically about injustice or the climate or racism or sexism or any of those things. We challenge injustice and that they're all good things. I'm just talking about what's valued. And we want to proclaim the gospel, the good news of Jesus to other people. So that model of church is more concerned with going out rather than bringing in. And this is a question that you might want to return to. The problem is that the church is central in both of those models. We either bring people in or we do things for them. We go out to them. And is there a different model in which we can relate to people beyond the limits of the church? That's my key problem. I'm going to stop sharing at that point. And hopefully that's given you something to think about. But Jane's going to take over now. And Jane is a canon missioner and vice dean at Chester Cathedral. She's taught all age groups, written extensively for schools and for teachers. But to me, actually, she's the first person who began to train me as a minister in the Church of England, for which I will always be grateful. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. So what I'm going to look at is that second economy beyond the walls. And the page reference, if you want to read it afterwards or you have it already, is 67 to 73. So there's a quote in the book. So Bishop Dilip de Shikara says, "We do not live for ourselves and all our energy. All our gifts are directed to abundant life for other." So this model, as Liz just said, is about the church giving absolutely freely. It's the church giving out. And they coin a word called kingdom, getting rid of the G, which means a flowing of outpouring love from the church into the wider world, expressed in service. Of course, there's still a significant investment here, but unlike the first economy, or as with the first economy, there's no expectation of financial return. It's simply a giving, an outpouring, a looking outwards. And the focus from the church tends to be on inequality and divisions in society. So helping the homeless, helping those who perhaps have no voice in society. So what we offered in the book are temptations to heroic power. And this second economy, they say, can be very seductive and destructive. It sounds lovely. They say there's a bit of a seduction in it, and they take the temptations of Jesus to talk about it. So Jesus' temptations test his sense of identity. And you remember that story? The devil says, "If you are the Son of God." So in other words, if you're really who you say you are, then do something. And then there's the three temptations. And the author suggests, what about the church? If you are the church, then ... Bit of a challenge maybe for our local church or for wherever we are placed. If you are the church, then. So let's look at three different powers. And the first power they suggest is the power of provider. So the devil says to Jesus, "Turn the stones into bread." So that way, Jesus can provide for others. He can be the one who can give to others because they are hungry. However, he would then know what was best for the others. He would say, "I know you want bread, so I'm going to give you bread." We've had this issue recently, in fact, with giving books to Melanesia, whereby someone said, "Let's go to the theological bookshop. They want some theological books. Let's give them those books." And someone else said, "We need to ask them first what books they really want, what would be useful, before sending stuff out to them, as if you like here, a provider." Quite a difficult issue. You're longing to help, but are you helping in the best way as a provider for others? And of course, from that, the authors say, you often get, or you can get, that feel-good factor, that addictive feeling. We sort of need hungry people if we're going to feed others. We need neighbours who have got empty hands. And then we respond. We don't often think about our own needs or acknowledge that maybe we need those people in order for us to respond, and that would be different personalities. There are other ways of dealing with this. You'll know that different charities work in different ways. And I like this quote: "Give a man," it could be a woman, of course, doesn't have to be a man, but the quote is a man. "Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime." It's much more about helping people on their way. But again, you would want to ask, do you want to learn to fish before you actually teach him to fish? And the 5 Talents charity, which is a great charity which enables others to set up sustainable projects, quite a small charity. But even with those, are we acknowledging where our own needs lie in reaching out to help? So then we come to the second one, the power of the performer, the second temptation. The devil says, throw yourself off the cliff and the angels will catch you. Showing your good works in the community, maybe increasing numbers in your church, maybe you're getting more toddlers, counting the people we've managed to feed through the food bank. That's about that kind of thing here. The glory might be to God, but does anybody ever want maybe a little glory for themselves? Some people say, I was never thanked. Maybe that thanks was a way of saying, actually, I wanted a bit of glory for myself. Maybe not. That's a kind of moral question we need to think about. If our neighbours, if we are the performers, so if we're the ones who are going to perform, throw ourselves off the cliff, then our neighbours are the audience. That sounds a little bit passive. And again, there's no interest in what the audience wants or says or is interested in. Have we asked them what they would really like? Then the third temptation is the power of possessing or being the possessor. The devil says, all this shall be yours if you'll only just worship me. Well, this will be familiar to many churches. There are often disputes about possession in churches. There's a territory. It's the kitchen belongs to those people who do those particular washing up or make the meal. The flowers have a territorial right often. I was told in one church I went to, the choir is always territorial. You'll always have an argument there about whether they should robe or not. So there's a territorial aspect in all our churches. We need to recognize it. I'm not saying it's always bad, but it's there. And then you have to ask the question, if there's a territorial aspect, who is being worshipped? Is God the one who comes first? And sometimes we have that sense of the church being inclusive and welcoming. But are we, as in that quote, you're welcome here, but this is how you have to behave while you're with us. In other words, you can't keep your woolly hat on, you can't wrap your scarf around your head. To go to the extreme, you can't skateboard down the aisle. Maybe you don't want that, but there are certain terms that we demand as a church when people come into our territory, if you like. And we need to think about that and decide what's right, what's appropriate, how welcome we are. The book says that the Church of England expects certain people to be at the table when decisions are made. So for instance, the House of Lords, we have the bishops there, we have people there who we expect to be there who are making decisions. So I wonder, out of those temptations, which are quite, I think they delve quite deeply, certainly for me, into my spirituality and my own existence. Which of those temptations to heroic power, as the authors explain them, do you recognize as most seductive for you personally, and maybe for the churches, or possibly for the organizations to which you belong? So there was the power of the provider. That's the one where you're giving and you're deciding what to give. The power of the performer, where you perform and you aren't really asking what the audience wants, but you're going to perform because that's what you think is needed. And the power of the possessor, the one who possesses their territory and maybe is a little bit closed and not open to other people. So those questions maybe I'll leave with you. Liz is going to invite you to speak in a moment, and please unmute yourself, either with questions or comments. So I'll just repeat those because that slide will go. Power of the provider, power of the performer, and power of the possessor. Which of those resonates with you personally, with your church, or with the organization with which you're connected? Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. If you know how to raise an electronic hand, then do that, because it's easier to spot. But if you don't know how to raise an electronic hand, sort of wave vigorously and I'll try to catch you. But you're over 2 screens now as well, which makes it tricky to do that. First comment or question, anybody? I'm looking around.
Be brave, you can't say anything wrong in this. Chaz is raised a hand. Sorry, it's a Pam.
Pam, right. Pam.
To me, it's power, but it's also it's control, isn't it? People like to control others, and they always have done, really. I was very struck because I know I attended in the cathedral, taught by Christopher Jameson in his book Sanctuary, which I quite liked. I mean, it's a personal thing whether you like it or not, but all this aspect of busyness and stuff like that, you know, it's all part of it, I think. Busyness, control, the way we are as human beings.
Yeah, power and control certainly go together, don't they? I was listening to the radio this morning on my way back from somewhere, and they were talking about leadership, and the person who was speaking, who I don't know, I can't remember now, said you can't conduct the orchestra without turning your back to the audience. So you don't need to take any notice of what people want or what they expect to hear, because you're busy conducting the orchestra so that you put on a good show. Yeah, I think that's true. Sophie, nice to see you. Hi.
Hi, sorry, I was a bit late, so you may have answered this question already. But just listening to you talk about the power, like the possession, like possessiveness of, particularly, I think for me anyway, I've experienced that in kind of music circles. And it's been said to me recently that that's really an obvious spiritual dynamic. Like, have you kind of covered that? Sorry, I'm late. Did you think about that as like a spiritual domain rather than just like simply wanting to have your corner of the church?
I'm going to immediately back that to my colleague.
No, we didn't. But for me, it is undoubtedly connected. In fact, I think all three of them are spiritual. I think you can feel possessed spiritually as well. Absolutely. Yes. And in terms of, I think that's a deeper temptation almost. There are different levels of temptation and different levels of meeting God. And I think each one of these is a deeper level of temptation. Yeah, absolutely, Sophie. And music's a great illustration. Do you want to say more about the music, Sophie, at all?
Do I want to? Should I? I think probably there's an element of, for me anyway, musicians are creatives. I'm not a musician, but I do sing. And I think maybe there's some sort of that artistic temperament in there, but it seems to me like it's so quickly becomes not about worshipping God and about performing, and it's hard to know how to respond to that other than prayerfully. But when you're dealing with people, responding with that.
And in the cathedral, we have very good musical director, and he's very keen that everyone does the best they possibly can. They have a very high standard of music, as you can imagine, but it's for God. And so it's not a performance. Each one is for God. So if one person is there in the congregation, that doesn't matter. If there's 100, it doesn't matter. It's there for God. And it's a mantra he says quite often. I've heard him say that, which is good to hear, because the temptation is that it's the performance. So we've got to get it absolutely perfect, because that's what it's about. And then you forget why you're doing it. And don't we all do that at different times with all the things we have? Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, on another sort of side issue, but related to that, I think performance can make us forget the people as well. So I was not our diocese, a different diocese. We're doing a conference for women, and they were thinking about who's the best people to lead it, and they ended up with a male chairperson, 3 male speakers, and a male conducting the plenary at the end, because they forgot that it was a conference for women. They just thought they'd get the best people to do it, which is very interesting. It wasn't Chester. Any more comments and questions? Or
I think in terms, sorry, am I unmuted?
Go on, Chris, now you're all right.
Yeah, I think in terms of control, I think I take your point about the music, but I think also if you've got a church where a lot of your fundraising is through hospitality, that too can predominate, and you lose almost the purpose in it, in that you're serving God, not just putting on really lovely afternoon teas. And I think that can mask things somewhat. And I think during the last few months, when we had to be very careful about how many people came into church, I think that controlling aspect became so much stronger because we were literally, weren't we, telling people where they could or couldn't sit, telling people they had to gel their hands, telling people how far away to remain from the priests giving out Holy Communion, bread and wine. And it was just, that hasn't helped really in a way, because that control was there. And I guess of the people who have returned to church, it's tended to be people who have been traditionally coming for many, many years, and they just accepted that control. But I do wonder how people who hadn't been in church before would respond to that. They would understand the need for it, but it is so controlling.
Yeah. Gavin, hi, nice to see you again. You're mute.
Hello, nice to see you. I thought I was on mute from the chairperson. I thought your model, if you can put this, I don't know whether you can put the slide back.
The models of church.
I mean, I was a little bit late, so I might have missed something, but perhaps you could clarify for me. It's the diagram with the people.
Yeah. That one.
Yeah,
or
that one.
That one. Yeah.
What was the previous one?
That one.
That's the desired state that.
It's not a desire. Neither is desired or otherwise. It's just that they're two different ways of looking at the economies of church. What the book does is say these are the two existing economies, and maybe what we need to do is think of a different economy.
That's fine, because that's what I wanted to ask is if you use the same, okay, there were two economies, which I totally get, but could it be possible to articulate what might be a better Christian economy, shall we say, that perhaps churches could reflect upon? And perhaps identify gaps and changes that might assist them. I absolutely get the concept that so often we overlay Christ with our own needs, shall we say. It's a human trait. And just as the devil tempted Christ, he's always sitting on our shoulder as well. So, it's always helpful to have something that could stimulate thought about how those models could be bettered, shall we say?
I guess the trajectory of the book is it's not about you really. It's not about the church. It's about the wider culture, and maybe the church should be willing to listen to what people beyond the church walls want and are interested in. Rather than giving them answers to questions they're not asking, which I think.
As a lay reader who has preached an awful lot, both mainly online for the last 18 months, which has been an enormous learning exercise for myself. But when you are in a church context, you tend to preach to those who are there and their expectations, which may not necessarily be what Christ wants. And therefore, it's easy to fall into the trap of leading a service and preaching in a particular way because of those who are in the audience, putting it bluntly. When in fact, I've often preached thinking, well, I could be more outward looking and acknowledging the needs of those who are not in church. Maybe the argument is that I should find opportunities to preach outside church in a way which I feel would be helpful to those who are looking for something in their lives. But I get that, your point, but it's not that easy if you're in a diminishing church that doesn't have many visitors and is quite established in its way. Would you care to comment?
Well, I suppose what the book does is look beyond preaching to what the church spends its energy and its efforts on. And so, you know, I've written 3 books on preaching, so I'm not going to say preaching isn't important. It is. But the church is more than that. And,
Yes,
you know, preaching should perhaps be there to mobilize, help people mobilize and talk about the gospel in more natural ways. But Jane, do you want to say anything on this?
No, I think you said it there, Liz, really, and I think it is about the action. I mean, it's but I think, Gavin, you're right. It's a huge challenge for preachers to say what you think the people in front of you want to hear, or are you going to say something totally different? You think is the gospel that people may not want to hear. To be really challenged, I think it'd be. No one ever says when they stand up in the pulpit, "What are you expecting to hear today from me?" That would be an interesting question.
Well, maybe I'll feel bold enough to do that. But as Liz knows me from old, I am slightly challenging. And I know my incumbent vicar, who's not there anymore, always thanked me for my challenges. But it is, you know, with a church that is on the face of it declining, we do need to get a message out there that's not centered on personal power, personal interpretations, but on the needs of the people. And I think today, you know, I was preaching this morning on it was the Mark 13, I think it was the Jesus's prophecy that the temple would fall down. And, you know, the society and the people are struggling with anxiety and, you know, the day-to-day problems of life, and yet not looking to the church to help them. And the church isn't signaling, we are here, we understand, Christ wants you to realize that, yeah, life is difficult, but with the support of the church community, you can get through it. We're just missing that, and the opportunities are diminishing all the time to get that church, that Christian, that Anglican message across.
Yeah. I'll just respond to that and then look for another hand, I think.
Yeah, I'll stop now.
Yeah, no. I was speaking to somebody just a couple of weeks ago, actually, who said that he would not feel comfortable to go into the church building while there are people there, because he felt that he would not be approved of. But he does go into church when there's nobody there, when he can find one that's open, because he meets God there, which I thought was very interesting. Any more hands going to wave to me? Yeah, Terry.
Right.
That's it.
I think it's an immense challenge, but I was even struck by the words, the power of provider, performer, possessor. The focus is more on the church there, whereas it's really God in this. And I believe strongly that the church should be enabling people who come on a Sunday and listen to live with God's love flowing through them during the day. And somehow in church, we sit in our seats and listen. And I think there needs to be opportunities for discussions, something to enable me to go out and with people I meet or that, to let the love of Christ flow through me.
Mm. Yeah. It's the tension of being both the body of Christ and a national institution at one and the same time.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Somebody I saw a hand then, it's gone. There we are. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think the challenge certainly for us is around the second economy. We spend a lot of time doing work within the community where I am, and I think it's so easy for us to be defining defining that rather and doing to rather than working with. Jane mentioned the feeling good about it, but actually assuming that we know what is best, rather than helping people to really express where they as a community are wanting to move, and they won't always be the same, but very often at least we can help people to be developing their voices, helping people to be developing their some sort of feel that they actually have control over something, which I think for so many people in UPA areas has gone, where they have been just used to having things done to them or things given to them, and that's not only in the UK, but now I've worked in other parts of the world where that's been the same again. Where we know and therefore we do, rather than actually enabling others. And so I think certainly for me that is one of my that's a temptation for me.
Yeah. That's a great question from Sophie as well. Do you think we try to move to solutions too quickly rather than being open to the fact that we might have a problem with how the church functions? That's similar to your question, Elizabeth, I think. Yeah.
And we don't listen necessarily.
We're very bad at listening. Yeah. Robert, you're mute at the moment.
Yeah, good afternoon. Isn't all this reflected in this debate or alleged debate at the moment going on between the form of the Church of England, between the traditional parish structure and what we might call, what's been called various things, fresh expressions, or basically moving to look like house churches and so on? We're really sort of struggling with our identity and our function. But we can't get away from the fact that whatever model we adopt, we are going to need leadership. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of vacuous nothingness if we're not careful. I haven't got any answers. I'm just posing a few questions.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah. There are models of leadership, aren't there? And then there are people who are leaders. And when I was teaching in further education, I used to say you can train the gifted, but you can't gift the trained. And sometimes we try and train leaders rather than look for people who have leadership potential, I think.
I think spotting potential is a tremendous gift. I mean, like you, I've worked in higher education, actually, and spotting even raw talent and encouraging it is a great gift. I mean, that was obviously in a secular dimension rather than a Christian dimension, but the same applies of seeing. I've actually worked in Melanesia, and well, actually in Papua New Guinea, not in the province of Melanesia, but same kind of people, and I was doing some evening Bible courses, theological education by extension, and there was a young fellow there who could see straight away had real hunger and real potential. And it was great to see that he was then encouraged to go into theological training to be a minister. It wasn't actually the Anglican Church, it was actually a Baptist church, but the context doesn't matter. And it's great to be able to see that. But the trouble is we then have these structures, and you see it very clearly in a situation like Melanesia, where the churches become clones of what we are here, which I think is very unfortunate. But people kind of adapt to it because they think that's what Christianity is. That's the form of that's how Christ wants the church to be. well, we're now beginning to really question that, aren't we?
Yes, yeah. I heard a good story. I think it was the Bishop of Manchester who was saying he was preaching in an African country somewhere and realised that he'd forgotten his preaching stole. So the service began and he nipped out and got it and then went into the pulpit, and that became part of the service in that particular church, that that the preacher started off without it and then went out to get it before they mounted the pulpit steps. So it might be powerful, but
yeah. No,
that's what I mean.
You've got to be very careful not to start new traditions.
Yes,
because I've heard, I've heard of stories where when the church leader has gone away for whatever reason, people have just not run services themselves because they're scared of getting it wrong.
Yes, yeah. There's a good comment in the chat here. I'm musing about giving control to others, but at the same time recognizing my own need for some control. Yeah. And it's the hardest thing, isn't it, when you're in the situation and you've not got control of it? You wonder what's going to happen. And I suppose that maybe that's where we say, well, actually, the church is God's, not mine.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Simon, who's on screen, will pick it up next week. So you can see Simon Chester is going to speak to us next week on who is marginalised by the church. I had in my mind a picture of someone I saw someone sitting outside Tesco's, asking for food, and somebody going to Tesco's and coming out with a sandwich. But someone else coming up to the same person and saying, do you eat meat or would you prefer cheese? And then going in and buying the sandwich. Very different way of approaching it, still with desire to help someone, but a way of involving and asking the person what they wanted. Thank you so much for joining us. Do join us next week, same time, same place, same link. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.